Really
All
here.
right. All right. So we are live. Hello, everyone. It has been too long. You are tuning into the Left Lens with Margaret Kimberley, the co host, and myself, Danny Haiphong. And today we have a special guest. We are going to be talking to Daniel Xie. He is an associate editor at the Canada Files. So we can discuss the role of Canada in this larger imperialist project, and he can talk about all the great work that the Canada Files is doing. Really intricate work, deep work on Canada's role in this global empire led by the United States. But first, I just want to say, whoever's watching this, if you're on Twitter, and I'll be saying this throughout, if you're on Twitter, if you're on Facebook, um, please do go to the YouTube channel, The Left Lens, and like that video. Make sure that if you're coming on here, you're liking the video because that
Mhm.
helps with the algorithm and it helps get this video boosted so Daniel's work can be promoted and so our channel can continue to get the support. So if you're on Facebook, Twitter, go to YouTube at Black Agenda Report presents The Left Lens. But without further ado, let's bring on Daniel so he can get the full hour because he's been doing a lot of work. Hi, Daniel. How are you?
I'm doing very well.
Great. It is great to have you. You all at the Canada Files have been doing such deep work on the role of Canada in reproducing and really expanding this nightmarish imperialist project led by the United States. And recently, you've written a really great article, which afterwards we will definitely link in the description, talking about how Canada has been a key force in propping up and militarizing the Colombian government. And recently in Colombia, back this spring, we saw huge unrest, uprisings, protests that have been brutally suppressed by government forces, the police, the military. Would you mind talking to us about, and our viewers, about that investigation, what you found, and why is it so important? Why is it so important to cover Canada's role in all of this?
So basically, to give a brief recap of the protests, since April 28, 2021, Colombia had in April 28 of 2021, a series of strikes and other ongoing protests manifested against the healthcare reforms proposed by incumbent President Ivan Duque. These healthcare reforms were framed as COVID relief and to test out the basic income program. But the reality is that these healthcare reforms were actually tax reforms that would have provided massive breaks for corporations while overtaxing the impoverished working class. And opposition to this tax reform led to the protests, and these protests had wide range of support from Colombian labor unions, student activists, various social movements tied to indigenous, women, and African Colombian communities and social organizations. So the protesters demanded not just an end to planned tax reforms, but the resignation of the Colombian government and the trials of many government officials, including former President Alvaro Uribe, for crimes against humanity. And while the Colombian government has scrapped its tax reform plans, they are not keen to relinquish power. Their responses have been extremely horrific. Protesters have claimed that there have been 2,000 instances of police brutality, multiple cases of rape and other sexual violence, and 200 disappearances. And it's been estimated by various NGOs that 34 deaths have occurred during the course of the ongoing protests. With Amnesty International also noting that the Colombian government has been illegally detaining and torturing protesters, with excessive force being used in cities such as Cali. And more recently, around July or late July or early August, the Colombian government launched mass arrests of suspected demonstrators, with 178 protesters being detained for their role in anti-government demonstrations, particularly those tied to the Premier Linea Protest Collective. That's how I think I pronounced it. Which they were basically protesters that armed themselves with stones and improvised shield to protect protesters from police, with the charges being deployed against them was basically low intensity terrorism. So now with that basic situation described, now I'm going to talk about why can't the Canadian connection to the crisis in Colombia. So when the protests flared up, many activists in Colombia noted that the Colombian police used armored personnel carriers to suppress the political opposition. These APCs were not manufactured in Colombia. They were manufactured by Incas, a Canadian company operating in Barrie, Ontario, specializing in the design and production of a wide range of armored vehicles like SUVs and the military executive SUVs, personal carriers, and military vehicles. When the Colombian National Police first acquired Incas in 2014 in response to the FARC insurgency, which was one of the longest insurgencies, perhaps the longest running insurgency in the history of the Americas, with the FARC, with the FARC, or the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, rising up to establish a socialist government and demand and push for equitable land reforms, as 83% of Colombian land has been owned by a small privileged elite. And this has been going on for like decades, if not centuries, from my discussions with Pablo Vivianco, the former director of Telesur and current member of the Canadian Latin American Alliance. So these vehicles were bought from Canada, first to use against FARC, and now with the peace treaty signed, with the signing of the peace treaty, they've been used against social movement leaders and other people protesting the fact that the conflict really never solved any of the systemic problems. And this is in part due to the far right, centered around President former President Alvaro Uribe, and his party have actually played a role in sabotaging the Colombian peace treaties to make sure no agreement was reached that could provide sort of land reform in the conflict zones, and to basically weaken any protections being prepared for like women, LGBTQ, and indigenous and Afro-Colombians. So basically, like, the Colombian government has been like borrowing from getting these APCs from Canada against FARC, and now against the people that's continuing to oppose the ongoing injustice perpetuated by the Colombian far right and the paramilitary forces. And the Incas was not the only company where Colombia got the APCs. In 2015, as noted by the International Quality and Productivity Center, Colombia paid $84 million for 32 bulletproof armed vehicles that were used to saber rattle with Venezuela, because the Colombian government blamed the Venezuelans for basically fomenting FARC supposed terrorism by FARC in Colombia. And this is not the only the aid given by Canada doesn't just stop there. In addition to allowing the sale of APCs to the Canadian government by the Canadian companies, the Canadian government under Stephen Harper had made it easy for Colombia to buy arms from Canada in its effort to arm its military and paramilitary groups against FARC. On January the 2nd, 2013, the Harper government basically added Colombia to the automatic firearms country control list. That it basically allowed them to purchase assault rifles from Canada, and this basically led to outcry from Amnesty International and Project Plowshares because of the human rights abuses of the paramilitary groups. But the Canadian government just ignored these concerns. And my research has found that this support for the Colombian government goes back even further to the 1990s under the Chrétien and early 2000s. The Canadian government then found ways to circumvent arms export limitations by sending CH-135 Huey and Bell 212 helicopters to be first delivered to the US and then shipped to Colombia through the US. So we can see here a sort of like the converging of the Canadian imperialism and the American empire in imperialism in trying to basically impose to prop up the far right government in Colombia. These helicopters were, of course, used in operations against the Revolutionary Armed Forces, and the helicopters weren't just the only armaments that were being shipped. Companies such as the Montreal-based Pratt & Whitney built jet engines to be used in Super Tucano aircraft that were manufactured in Brazil, but the engines were clearly provided in Canada. So you can see from the sale of helicopters and fighter jet parts that the Canadian government basically, like, even if they don't deliberately deliver the arms shipment to Colombia, they use basically some underhanded methods or some backdoor, like say providing these equipment, the tools to Brazil to build these planes to be used in Colombia, or to sell them through the help of the US. And this isn't even getting into the direct support provided by Canada in providing military training for military and security forces. The Canadian embassy in Colombia notes that the Canadian government provides military training to Colombia through the Anti-Crime Capacity Building Program, which allows Canada to provide $5.4 million to strengthen Colombia's security force. And these security forces were trained by the RCMP and the Canada Border.
Daniel, let me just ask you a question really quickly. I know there's a lot of information. It's clear from what you've said that and what you've written that Canada is a U.S. partner in imperialism. Yes. And not just in Colombia either, in Haiti and other countries interfering in
Venezuela, Bolivia, the Lima.
So here's my question for you. Americans tend to think of Canada as being more progressive than their country. But that is definitely not true. Politically in Canada, is there pushback from Canadian citizens on these regarding these interventions? You haven't talked about it yet, but Canadian mining companies play quite a role around the world in these imperialist interventions. How do Canadians see what their government is involved in?
So this is what's particularly unfortunate regarding her Canadian perception of their government's crimes. Foreign policy is quite literally not a topic that's been discussed in Canadian political discourse. Like, there's a section of the American liberal and even some progressives that basically view Canada as a nation that America should aspire to, rather than being America's imperial partner to the north. And basically, like, this myth is kept apart by the fact that Canada doesn't promote foreign policy. It basically promotes this idea of quote-unquote peacekeeping, despite the peacekeeping being obviously tied to some dubious or imperialist aspects, especially in places like Haiti. And basically what I'd say is that there's not really a lot of like back support for like in anti-imperialist foreign policy in Canada. The three major parties: the Liberal Party, the Social Democratic New Democrats, and the Conservative Party, as well as the far right People's Party. They're all united with the same foreign policy beat, which is to proper right-wing regimes such as the fascist Bolsonaro regime in Brazil, the far-right fascist Ivan Duque and regime in Colombia, really before him, the attempted coup by Juan Guaido in Venezuela and Agnes in Bolivia, and basically, as well as not just in here, but also to basically ratchet up the support for Cold War with China, which itself fed into the arrest of Meng Wanzhou who recently was released on a conditional agreement. It fed into the Canada basically acting as the US's imperial lapdog and arresting Meng Wanzhou, and no one in Parliament, virtually no one in Parliament raised an eye on this, and basically so there's this unified imperialist consensus that's been propped up by the fact that foreign policy has been obfuscated and suppressed in Canadian political discourse. It's always about domestic or economic, but no one talks about, like, say, the cost, the role Canada had in maintaining the U.S. imperialism in favor of its ties to the U.S. and the various mining companies that now constitute 75% of mining industry globally.
Yes. Well, I think you bring up a lot of important points, Daniel. And today, I know in Canada is Truth and Reconciliation Day. Is that happening today? And that is in relation to, and I'll let you explain some of the hypocrisy around this, but it's in relation to the boarding schools that Indigenous peoples in Canada.
Residential schools.
Right. Yes, exactly. And so let's move to China, and let's move to some of this this hypocrisy in terms of the propaganda that Canada promotes, similar to the United States, promotes itself as kind of a quote unquote liberal democracy. And then we just saw, as you mentioned, the release of Meng Wanzhou, which everyone should really raise their glass, and a lot of the hard work that you, Daniel, and I know a lot of Canadian anti-war activists. I know I saw Arnold August in the chat. A lot of anti-war activists in Canada were really committed.
Yes, like Canada Files, Arnold August, as well as the Hamilton Coalition.
Yes. Got to shout out the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, because they did a lot of work around the Free Meng Wanzhou campaign. And now she is free, and that is incredible. And we should definitely all be celebrating that. But tell us about this agreement, because you also wrote a piece recently. You co-authored a piece with your fellow editor, Aidan Jonah, about the two Michaels, as they are called, those who were recently released by the central government in China as a condition for Meng Wanzhou's release. So tell us about that story. How is it different? Because there's a lot of false equivalencies in the media right now that we're seeing, where the two Michaels are being
painted as innocent.
Yes, as innocent bystanders. They got caught in the crossfire of this tech war, of this war between two countries. What is the true story behind the two Michaels? If you wouldn't mind telling our audience about them.
The two Michaels, despite the fact the two Michaels are actually a great way how the Canadian government tries to push foreign policy to the sideline and try to make people, both the Canadian government and the apologists for the Canadian state, push the idea of the foreign policy to the sidelines. Because the Canadian mainstream media, if you look at it, as you said, promotes the idea that the Michaels are innocent, they're the victims of the supposed quote-unquote bad China. But our research shows that they're actually spies, and their goals operations in China, it isn't good. So the Michael Kovrig, he's a member of the International Crisis Group, which framed itself as working to prevent wars and maintain global stability, yet as exposed by the Grey Zone and the New Left Review before them, its policies have been actually used to enforce regime change and the expansion of NATO and other US-led alliances in Europe, the Middle East, and around the world, in places such as like the ICG itself played a role in spreading the intervention of NATO in Yugoslavia and promoting the US-led invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. In Syria, they basically whitewashed the al-Nusra Front and allowed one of the leaders, Muhammad al-Julani, to be platformed by PBS, a seemingly liberal mainstream U.S. news outlet, in June of 2021, and they worked with the Tigray People's Liberation Force which had been responsible for atrocities like killing their own citizens and using child soldiers, even stealing foreign aid, in order to be working with them to basically manufacture consent for a secessionist war. And so basically it's clear that the ICG is not good news. And what does Michael Kovrig role play in this? Now, ICG, after the Iraq War, they sought to facilitate regime change in Iran and North Korea. And in North Korea, the Michael Kovrig viewed the plan of the ICG was to basically push North Korea to abandon its nuclear program, which didn't work out. And they basically tried to force them to surrender their nuclear program, and if that doesn't work, try to get consent from China and Japan in order to cooperate for a military invasion. And Kovrig made it clear that Chinese cooperation in his writings is needed to facilitate this regime change. And so he notes, for instance, that like when Xi Jinping started to improve relations with North Korea, he basically viewed this as a potential danger to the ICG's goals, and it shows that basically the ICG, to this day, is still committed in fomenting regime change in North Korea and perhaps China too.
Well, it's funny, Daniel. It sounds like the ICG is just a cutout for the surveillance state. Is that correct to say?
No, the ICG is the International Crisis Group. It's basically
I know what it is. I know the acronym, but it sounds like the role that it plays is a role of backing the surveillance state and backing all the imperialist actions that we've been talking about.
Indeed, and it actually functions as a sort of surveillance state to like the government is targeting. So Michael Spavor is friends. Let me to discuss this, it's important to go over a bit about Michael Spavor. Michael Spavor was basically, he created a sort of a tourism industry called Peg 2 Industries, working in North Korea, and he basically made contact with figures in the North Korean government, and even personally met with Kim Jong-un, and he basically used this position to take pictures of military equipment as well as infrastructure being prepared for the Belt and Road Initiative. And what's so interesting about that is that when they were arrested, the Michaels were accused of conducting low-level espionage through these photos. And since Kovrig works with the ICG, I can only assume that basically, my guess is that, in my observation, or rather, it's that the Michaels, they're deliberately taking military hardware pictures and the pictures of the infrastructure for the Belt and Road, so they could be sabotaged by the ICG and by U.S.-led alliances in the Asia-Pacific region.
Okay,
And let's. Oh, sorry. So,
oh,
America, go.
I just have just one quick follow-up. Sorry, Danny. I know we usually alternate, so I'm butting in on Danny's
It's
time.
all right. It's all right.
But the case of Meng Wanzhou is interesting. That if the Canadian government had been smart when the Trump administration asked to arrest her, they would have said no. The case was not a good one. It's something that's generally held civilly. The United States doesn't have the right under international law to snatch people up anywhere in the world. But what I have seen from Canadian commentators is that there's very little pushback about the decision to have arrested her in the first place. And that people have been whipped up into this patriotic frenzy about the two Michaels and China is so bad. So it seems to me that nobody's asking hard questions about how that decision was made in the first place. Is my observation correct?
It's 100% true. Even like the only people who are like criticizing this are the various genuine anti-war organizations, as well as as well as the Communist Party of Canada, which I am a member of, and elements of the left flank, like of the NDP, that's been shut out by the rest of the parties, both the social democratic and the more center left wing, both wings of which have shut out the far left flank while marching to the beat of the Cold War against China.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Meng Wanzhou, what's so interesting, I think, about her case is that she was really, there's all these talks about this crossfire between the US and China around big tech. Meng Wanzhou, a big part of this extra jurisdictional kind of dictates that Canada and the United States were enforcing against her, this idea that they have any right to really imprison a CFO of a Chinese corporation is ridiculous. Based on what they were saying was that she committed fraud, which placed HBSC at risk of essentially violating our U.S. sanctions on Iran. So this just goes to show how much Canada is really a junior partner of the United States, that they'd be willing to keep Meng Wanzhou under house arrest for 3 years based on the assertion that the U.S. has the right to enforce jurisdiction internationally around sanctions. But more than that, what's so interesting about what you're saying, Daniel, is that the two Michaels were literally engaging in what could never be participated in by you, me, any of us on this stream, anyone. If we tried to do that to the Canadian military, to the U.S. military, we would be run off and probably arrested as committing espionage for what these individuals were doing in China, literally taking pictures, literally using the tourism industry, sitting on the DPRK Chinese border to essentially spy on both countries, spy on China. And we're supposed to believe that these individuals are not only innocent, but also victims of so-called Chinese quote unquote authoritarianism. This is, I think, one of the most insidious parts about this new Cold War drive led by U.S. imperialism, but of course, happily followed by Canada, is that it turns literally our enemies into heroes. This is the whole idea, is to make us believe that U.S. wars and Canada's participation in them are somehow heroic, while on the other hand, someone who is actually innocent, like Meng Wanzhou, literally just doing her job, just negotiating business with economic enterprises around the world, somehow that makes her a criminal. And a lot of it is due to the fact that actually China and Canada and the rest of the Western world. They just can't compete anymore around these huge, essential questions of high technology. And so this was really a way to try to, how should I say? Yes, exactly. Assert leverage over Huawei, trying to destroy that corporation. And it failed immensely. I mean, it failed incredibly. And I think we really need to take note of that. But anyway, Daniel, do you have any comments?
No other comments except the fact that you got it really correct, that this thing is part of like these moves. I'm also going to know, first of all, one of the common accusations about the Meng Wanzhou and the Michaels was that the Michaels were treated in an extremely untransparent and authoritarian way by the Chinese government. This is extremely hypocritical because, like, the Canadian government, their own spying cases, they've not released any transparent information. For instance, Chinese-Canadian naval engineer Qin Quinton Huang from Hamilton was arrested for spying for China on 2013 for passing information on Canada's frigate program. And according to Huang's defense, the warrant and affidavit are so censored that Huang could not even testify the validity of the warrant or make any full answers to the defense. It basically put him in an impossible position where basically they use these accusations to like ferment like leverage against him. So basically and they've also not released any information on the 2019 arrest of Cameron J. Ortiz, a senior RCMP intelligence officer that was identified as the supposed source of Chinese intelligence by the United States. So they basically call out China for being this authoritarian country, or this country that's being obsessed with treating people in untransparent ways, when their own espionage charges are, as I put it, really untransparent.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, it sounds a lot like what happens here with many people who are Chinese nationals or of Chinese ancestry, who are constantly being accused, excuse me, of espionage, and Chinese students are some being kicked out of the country altogether, restricted on what they can study. So that does sound very familiar. But I had a comment and a question about the core group of which Canada is a member, which basically treats Haiti as a colony of the U.S., the EU, Canada, the UN, choosing Haiti's presidents. And we're hearing a lot now about Haitian migrants trying to enter the country, along with people from many other countries, by the way, on the southern border. And the strife in Haiti is caused by these interventions from outside. And can you talk to us about these mining companies and their role in Haiti and in other places in the hemisphere?
So I'm going to talk about specifically so I'm going to first talk about Colombia, the mining companies in Colombia. So Canadian mining operations in Colombia have actually made things really, 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 really. Canadian mining companies in Colombia has made things really worse from really worse. Basically, since the 1990s, the Canadian government has been working on ways to liberalize the Colombian economy, and what they've done was basically create a constitutional amendment that gave Canada 40%, and basically mining companies 40% of the land in Colombia, and this is really horrible for the Colombian people. Basically, the expansion of the power of the Colombian mining companies, thanks to the Canadian proposed mining reforms, it facilitated the weakening of environmental regulations and the weakening of labor protections, while opening land held by indigenous people and Afro-Colombians to further exploitation. And this basically made the already inaccessible land for most of the population even more even more inaccessible, because these people, like the Afro-Colombians, the indigenous people, were basically forced out whenever a Canadian mining company was set up shop there, and entire populations would have their homes destroyed due to the rapid expansion of the Canadian mining companies. And these mining companies are basically working with Colombian death squads to enforce their influence in the area. Since, for instance, like Canadian mining companies like Eco Minerals, formerly Greystar Resources, they use paramilitaries as security forces to defend their profits and their extraction sites, and enforce land grabs at the barrel of basically a gun at the expense of working class, indigenous, and Afro-Colombian populations. And this isn't the first time my analysis and my research has dealt with Canadian mining companies the Canada files. This isn't the first time the Canada files has dealt with, the repression of the role Canadian mining companies do have in maintaining imperialism in the global south. In a 2020 article we had by Ruhi Rizvi on May 9th, 2020, the title was "Canadian Mining Companies Exploit COVID-19 and Repression of Indigenous People in Bolivia during for corporate profit." It discusses the Canadian role in the Bolivian coup, and basically it mentions that the far-right coup regime, they were in talks with the Canadian mining officials to set up new mining projects, and the Canadian mining companies have in the past looked to Colombia as a potential site for look to Bolivia as a potential site for the exploitation of minerals. Like in 2007, the founder of Barrick Gold, who's now deceased, Peter Monk, basically wrote a letter, an op-ed to Financial Times, where he demonized Hugo Chavez and Evo Morales as for their push for mining sovereignty and increasing public stake in resource extraction to a disadvantage of foreign investors. So Canadian mining companies have always saw Venezuela or Bolivia as the potential targets for the expansion of the mining industry, which explains their support for the Bolivian coup and their eagerness to get on board with Jeannie Agnes, the far-right president, opening up more opportunities for the Canadian mining investments. And this is only the tip of the iceberg, to say the least. The Canadian mining companies like Barrick Gold have been responsible for horrific atrocities and horrific abuses in the global south, in New Guinea, in parts of Africa, in the Dominican Republic, where basically residents living near the Pueblo regional mine have reported basically lumps or lesions, lesions, that's how on their bodies falling basically because they were basically infected by the cyanide contaminated water in the area, and barric gold they've been exposed for like in New Guinea and Tanzania, according to Mining Watch, for systemic security abuses at barric gold mines and assaults committed against like men, women, and children, indigenous populations. Latin America is just the tip of the iceberg. Like Canadian mining companies have invested, according to a Twitter tweet. Like they've invested in around 31.6 billion in operations in Africa, and I just discussed some of the atrocities of the Peter Monk and Barrick Gold. So the it's the Canadian mining companies have overall played I'm not entirely familiar with the role of Canadian mining companies, specifically in Haiti, but they played a large role in like facilitating imperialism as a partner of the U.S. and towards their own corporate ambitions around the world. And I would not be surprised if they had some mining interest in Haiti that they would wish to see to.
Indeed. For those who are watching, make sure that you are liking the stream. If you're on social media, Twitter, Facebook, do go to the YouTube channel, Black Agenda Report Presents the Left Lens. Come on over, participate in the chat, subscribe to the channel. You have given us a lot of information, Daniel, about just how insidious Canadian imperialism really is. So it's no surprise that you, Aiden, and others have gotten together to try to expose this imperialism. But I want to give you the opportunity in this last 15 minutes or so to tell the story of the Canada Files. What made you all come together and want to form this media outlet? What are some of the inspirations? And just if you could just tell the story of how your work began.
So, so I say that Aiden is a much better person to ask about his personal journey and experiences. But for me, I say that one of some of our inspirations are, like, say, anti-imperialist websites like the Grey Zone, as well as other like news sites like other anti-imperialist like Latin American news sites like the Oriental Tribune and Tele Sur. Those were some of our inspirations. And basically we started out I started out writing for Canada Files in the 2020 and we initially focused on more general global or American news. Some of my earlier writings and some of the earlier writings on the site were focused on basically the Bernie Sanders race, but we decided, and I even had an article that was basically a pop culture analysis, and another article that I wasn't proud of that I've decided to delete, and it was basically being used as a target by right-wing. An article that I wrote was basically used to basically target me online by right-wing and both right-wing and, like, say, social democratic forces. And so that article has now since been deleted, but I have a copy of it, but it's probably not going to see the light of day ever again. But gradually we focus more on Canadian perspective, focusing on the Canadians, the failure of the social democratic left, the NDP, to take a firm anti-imperialist stance, and the failure of the Green Party, which also had a weird problematic relation with the left, to also take a firm anti-imperialist stance. And with anti-imperialist stance, and we've also focused on like issues such as the Palestine, the relation of the social democratic parties to the Cold War with China, and how some major figures within the party are trying to basically rally up the social democratic left in order to form a sort of bulwark defending the nationalistic flag waving and the drive to the second Cold War. And the China's response to COVID and us seeing the growth of xenophobia and the Meng Wanzhou case, as well as the Meng Wanzhou case, as well as seeing the fear mongering against China, not just from the established press, but also from the social democratic and even a few obstinately quote unquote left press, is part of the is informs us in our push for fighting the second Cold War narratives and trying to make foreign policy come to the forefront in the Canadian political discourse. I believe that like the foreign policy in the end, like we really aren't this sort of like good. We really aren't this sort of good alternative to the U.S. We're just the same kind of imperialist engaged in the same kind of imperialist engaged in the same kind of the sort of imperialist actions. And it's really important we bring this to the stage at a time when the social democratic left has given up, had embraced fully the right wing of the foreign policy, and elements of the left has embraced the right wing of the foreign policy on specifically the second Cold War. There was a magazine site in Canada for the left that basically at one point they were going to publish some articles critiquing the second Cold War, but there was an internal revolt by the more right-leaning members that saw the more anti-imperialist figures leave the outlet, and the plans to basically take a stance against the second Cold War being dropped in favor of a vague neither X nor Y political position that actually ends up benefiting X. In this case would be Canadian and American imperialism. So I believe that the Canadophiles will play a major role in pushing foreign policy to the forefront.
Well, you know, it's funny you should talk about the social democrats, because I think the issue of imperialism defines who's really on the left and who is not. And we have that problem here and throughout the I hate the term West, Europe and the US, the capitalist wealthier nations, that people are allowed to call themselves leftists when they're not, instead of being firmly opposed to imperialism. So I find that that's not just a problem in Canada, is my comment. So it wasn't really it
really wasn't. Like I'm familiar with the history of the socialist movement and Marxism. This problem isn't actually something that even emerged recently.
Right.
Recently, with a certain part of the left unwilling to take a nuanced look at various situations like, say, the second Cold War with China. But it goes back 100 years to the start of the First World War, where you had the more nationalistic, oriented, and patriotic socialist, social democratic forces that basically sided with their country's government against the international working class in leading a drive to war. Like some of the key offenders were the French, German social democrats, and the English the British Socialist Party. It's important to remember that the social democratic ideas, as we see them, come from Edward Bernstein, who basically rallied against Marxist orthodoxy by painting this idea that capitalism is indestructible and the best the left can do is accommodate to it, which I believe informs the beliefs of the many of the social democrats that they want accommodation into the capitalist and imperialist system because under the deluded belief that the reforms they seek will somehow be realized, when in fact this position just further entrenches imperialism.
Yeah, and I want to add to that too is that we are now in an immense crisis. I mean, it's arguable that in that period of 100 years ago, there was also a crisis. There was World War. There was a World War. There was an economic crisis looming, and eventually being supposedly the biggest one that we've had. But now the United States in this entire imperialist system is finding itself for the first time in a state of decline, because all throughout that period, what you were mentioning, Daniel, there was still a vicious competition that was leading to a higher level of imperialist domination, technology advancement. Now the opposite is happening. The United States and its junior partners, they're crumbling in a lot of ways. They are imposing vicious austerity, and they are using endless war as their principal mechanism for maintaining domination. And while there are many similarities to prior periods, now the crisis is so acute that social democrats are not only patriotically defending their countries, they're doing a lot of mental gymnastics and twisting themselves into pretzels in a lot of ways, trying to maintain the veneer of quote unquote social democracy in order to ensure that certain interests are not angered, like the military industrial complex, while at the same time posing as so-called progressives. We have that in the United States to an even more immense degree, because in the United States, you don't even have, right, single-payer healthcare. You don't even have any investment in public institutions of any kind. I mean, that has never really existed, and whatever form it had taken in the past has been gone for many years now. So this is a very acute period of crisis with the pandemic, with the economic crisis, with all of the deaths and destruction and that imperialism has wrought. And we do have a lot of discontent, and some of that has turned into some movement activity. Some of that has turned into despair, and the ruling class, this imperialist ruling class, is doing all that it can to sustain itself. And Canada, I think you bring up such important information about Canada, because Canada kind of lurks in the background, similar to the rest of the NATO countries, similar to a lot of these international imperialist arrangements, even these covert arrangements like AUKUS and the Five Eyes, right? The partnerships, the partners, they kind of lurk in the background. You don't really understand what they're doing unless you have people like yourself covering it. So we want to thank you so much for this, and definitely want to know if Margaret has any closing comments. Daniel, if you have any closing comments. If you're watching this, make sure you're liking this stream. Make sure you're boosting it. You're subscribing. But yeah, Daniel, do you want to take it away? Any closing thoughts?
So some closing thoughts. I believe that so in response to the social democratic to the joint march to a second Cold War by the social democratic figures and by the right and the liberals in the by the right and the liberals, I believe we need a unified movement of the progressive forces that are willing to break ranks with the social democrats in order to oppose the sort of the second Cold War. In Canada, in Canada, I'm a member of the Communist Party, and despite the fact that the media focuses so much on the Communist Party's vote share in order to delegitimize it, the social democratic figures, they like to say, "Oh, the communists are just a book club of like 400 to 500 people." When in fact, like we've shown up in every single rally or demonstration. We've organized solidarity rallies for Cuba when like the counter revolution recently was brewing, and we've consistently pushed back against anti-China propaganda, and there's been a growing segment of the people that's been despairing at the NDP's foreign policy that are taking interest in the Communist Party. That basically, like, I think I think that in Canada we should have we should have the progressive forces and that are willing to work against the Social Democrats and the communist movement against the drive to the second Cold War. In the US, I'd say that like organizations like the Chow Collective are doing a significant job in pushing back against the second Cold War propaganda, and as much as it may be a bit problematic to give them credit, I'd also have to give some credit for the DSA's International Committee in breaking ranks with the rest of the organization's push towards like social democratic reform and a pro-US foreign policy in favor of, say, at least considering the positions on China, and allowing Chow Collective and people like Chow Collective, Vijay Prashad to basically work with them in hosting a no Cold War event. So I think there is this sort of discontent brewing, and I think it's important for the left to push for anti-imperialist, anti-war movement against the second Cold War before it escalates further or worse into a potential hot war that could have catastrophic consequences for everyone.
Well, yes. Well, thank you so much, Daniel. I just wanted to, as we wind down here, you made some great points about the First World War and these social democratic forces who were not on the right side and ended up joining in this effort in that disastrous war. This is a time for people to remember those mistakes, and for us to have international solidarity. So I'm very glad you were able to join us, and we talked about issues that our two countries have in common, and how people who are left around the world can be in solidarity. So the Canada Files do great work, and I'm urging our viewers and listeners to read the Canada Files, because you guys are doing some really good stuff.
Much appreciated. I've shared our Twitter and Facebook information.
Oh, sure.
Chat. If you wish to post them on the comments for everyone to see, do it because like we are currently doing a fundraiser for the Canada Files in order to strengthen anti-imperialist reporting.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
In Canada, and I think it's important that the Canada Files gets further influence and further influence, and to challenge the pro-war media on both the right wing and the social democratic element side of the Canadian politics.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. I've shared those out in the live chat, so definitely check them out. But thank you again, Daniel. Of course, thank you, Margaret, for coming and for doing this tonight. It's been a while, but we will be back next month So peace out. Thank you for this stream. Continue to boost it, like it.
Pleasure talking with you.
Yes, it was a pleasure. Peace out,
Thank
everyone.
you. Thank you. Peace.